Good morning. Back here again with Fernanda Perez, cross-border journalist, and I'm John Bonfiglio, Talk Radio Latin America correspondent. It's the morning after the night before, in the sense of the second night of the first Democratic debates, where we got to see the second 10 candidates have their first airing in public of their ideas, views, positions, etc. We're going to talk through a little bit of how we felt they came across, and then maybe link it a little bit to a Latin American context. Fernanda, how did you sense that the debate played out?
Well, I think Kamala Harris definitely made a big splash with a bunch of her comments, especially in her attacks toward Joe Biden, who is the front runner in this race as of now. And because no other candidate had attacked him before, directly attacked his policies, up until Kamala Harris challenged his stance on civil rights yesterday.
And how did you feel Biden responded or failed to respond to that?
So what Kamala Harris challenged him on was his stance on busing in attempts to integrate segregated schools back when that was happening. And Joe Biden said that she miscommunicated his stance on the issue, but Kamala Harris was actually pulling straight from a quote that Joe Biden had said beforehand, and he was very noticeably taken aback. Kamala Harris also used her positionality as the only Black woman on stage to tell him that she was actually bused to integrate schools, and after that, Joe Biden seemingly lost his footing. He seemed to also cut his answers short by saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, my time is up," and kind of withdrawing from the debate. It was very noticeable, and all the outlets seemed to have picked up on that.
Sure. So just to break it down, there was a vote in which a federal vote in which Joe Biden voted against a federal judgment, a federal law being passed in terms of desegregation of buses. Joe Biden's defense was that was best left to the states' rights, whereas Kamala Harris then stepped in and said that in some cases the states did not do the right thing, and that's when the federal government had to step in. So there's some truth to both sides, but for sure it was a very dramatic moment in which she stood out from the crowd and challenged his record on integration. How do you feel that there's a similarity or lack of similarity between integration and civil rights as regards the African American community and the Latino community? Are they two things that we should see entirely differently, or is there some overlap between those two?
Well, I think that there are two completely different issues, in that the Black population has always been federally oppressed by the government, whereas the Latino community has been socially and in some cases federally oppressed. But the truth is that the Latino community does profit from anti-Blackness sentiments in the United States. So I think they are two very different issues that the candidates are up against.
As regards some of the other candidates, obviously a very widespread field. Some people on the panels who I'd never heard of or seen ever before. The other big name obviously was Bernie Sanders, who made the last time with Hillary Clinton. He also is markedly weak as far as integration goes. He seems to have no answer as regards. He's stronger in other areas, but he seems to have no answer as regards what he's done in pro the African American community. How do you think his position played out over the course of the debate?
Well, Bernie Sanders yesterday had a overall weak performance. Individually, his ideas were very widespread throughout the field of candidates, Medicare for all, for example, but Bernie Sanders himself didn't have a strong performance in regard to integration or anything really. He had a moment where he talked about foreign policy, but that was really it. Bernie Sanders was not a strong candidate in yesterday's debate.
I think one of the interesting things about these first debates is how markedly leftist the politics is. I mean, for sure, this will move. There'll be a general rightward drift as this moves through the election cycle. But it has surprised me the level of detailed policy and ideology of the centre and beyond left that's been not just discussed but agreed with by almost all candidates in terms of Medicare for all, almost a number of candidates banning private healthcare. All candidates yesterday raised their hands in terms of supporting free healthcare for undocumented migrants and so on. Has that surprised you at all in terms of the leftward shifts that these debates have taken, or was that to be expected with the recent individuals who've been elected to office as part of the Democratic Party in the US?
I think what's surprising is the amount of support that the more leftist candidates are getting, because they are picking up their policies from responses that they've been getting from the public. And for example, centrists on these two debates both nights have come out losing, essentially. And for example, Marianne Williamson, who almost nobody knows, I think she's a self-help author. She even talked about reparations for slavery in regard to the African American community, which is something that I don't think any centrist would mention in fears of the backlash that they might get. Yeah, and just the fact that things like this were mentioned, like you said, the coverage for immigrants in regard to healthcare, the candidates talking about their first steps in office being to combat climate change, as it is an existential threat, as somebody said yesterday. All of these are very, very leftward stances that we're seeing, and I think that's why centrists are being left out of the conversation, because they don't have policies that apply to that, and so that leaves everybody else that is more leftist to talk while they are left in the shadows.
Sure. I thought one of the interesting phrases yesterday as well was when Kamala Harris said, as you correctly say, that climate change was an existential threat to our species. The more normal way to phrase that would have been that climate change is an existential threat to Americans. It's unusual for the entire human species to be invoked, because on the whole Americans care, or any voting bloc will care about themselves first and what's over the border second. I think the other really surprising thing in a Latin American context is that much of the border debate has actually ended up being focused on the countries where the migrants are coming from as well, and has said we can't just deal with this in a border context, but we actually also need to deal with it in terms of the countries themselves. These people are leaving for a reason. In one of the more notable lines, Julian Castro on the first night called for a new Marshall Plan for the Northern Triangle of Guatemala, Honduras and El Salvador, which again is really quite unusual, not just policy making, but also unusual public language to be evoking. And there was almost no dissent from this across the board. Almost all of the candidates, I felt, recognised, whether this ends up obviously being pushed through in policy once people are in power or not, but almost all candidates publicly recognised that there was this need to actually invest in these countries root and branch in order to do something about the migrant crisis, in inverted commas, at source.
Yeah, and even further than that, for example, like you said, Joe Biden did say that he wants to invest in Central America, but then Marianne Williamson again took it further to the left and actually brought up the fact that interventions on behalf of the United States have actually led to worse things in Latin America than they have led to improvements. And that's something that the United States, in all honesty, does not talk about. And that being brought up on a presidential debate is something that surprised me, to be completely honest. Marianne Williamson did come out with the more leftist answers, if if that makes sense. But the fact that she mentioned that at all, and that she didn't get any pushback from people that have made policy in the United States, or that have taken a part in that, such as Joe Biden says something. It says that they know that if they do attack that stance, they will lose voters.
Yeah, for sure. Again, I think one of the interesting things at the start of the debate about her was with her being a relatively unknown figure, at least amongst a broad range of public that haven't read her self-help books. There was a danger of her coming across as something of a laughing stock. What's she going to say? Is she kooky? Is she way out there? And a lot of what she was saying, in standard centrist terms, was definitely, significantly to the left. But I thought there were serious points well made, which were then taken on by the other candidates.
Yeah, I think that's what happens with most of the points in debates when there's a general consensus. For example, somebody would make a comment about Medicare for all, and then somebody would take it up, say that they support it, and then expand on it. But I think that's something that we saw on night one and on night two, but it was surprising that it came from somebody like Marianne Williamson, who a lot of people were not familiar with.
We haven't mentioned Pete Buttigieg, first openly gay candidate, mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He also came across fairly well and carved up a space for himself, I felt. How did you feel that he came across? I mean, he's something of a rising star of the Democratic Party, heard a lot about him, but certainly he, in a very kind of quiet, forceful, humble way, he certainly came across as an individual to be reckoned with.
Yeah, well, I think his weakest part in the debate was when the police brutality affair came up that happened in South Bend. He was actually very pointedly attacked by another candidate because he had refused to fire the chief because he was not wearing his body camera. And I think that's when he kind of lost. He had been gathering a lot of but he had made some good points up to then. But he knew this was coming because it had been in the news for a couple of weeks. He had gotten a lot of backlash from voters, from social media. And I think that today, in the political context of the United States, if you do not have an answer for that, you're going to have a very hard time in the political field.
As far as the Latino vote in the US goes, who are the candidates most likely to pick up the Latino vote? Should they, well, in this primary cycle? I mean, I guess Julian Castro is a really obvious one. Any others that spring to mind?
Well, yes, like you said, Julian Castro. I think a lot of even Latinos didn't really know about Julian Castro or where he stood on different policies, but after night one, I do think that we could see some votes going to Julian Castro. I know that some centrists, Latinos, would also consider Beto O'Rourke because of where he's from. And the rest, I think it's really going to be up to time to tell, because there's so many candidates in the field that until it narrows down a little bit, it's going to be very hard.
Sure, and if we look at, if you like, the different tiers of the candidates, so the likes of Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, if you like, could be referred to as tier one candidates, just in terms of where they're polling, but also in terms of their campaign staff and how organised a team and an electoral machine they have, if you like. As far as tier two candidates, are we looking at a Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, any others you'd add into that tier two section?
I think after the debates, I would add Julian Castro in there maybe, and Kristen Gillibrand.
Interesting, because we haven't spoken about her. Can you maybe say a little bit about how her presence yesterday?
Yeah, well, she was very strong on women's reproductive rights, which has been up in the air, or not up in the air, but
is under threat.
Yes, because of the new administration and the Supreme Court conservative majority, because states have created laws that are intended to create a spark for them to make it up to the Supreme Court, and in hopes for the conservative majority to roll back on Roe v. Wade. And Kirsten Gillibrand really, as well as Kamala Harris, both spoke very strongly about women's reproductive rights, saying that they couldn't believe that in 2019 they were still debating whether women could have a right to their bodies. And them being the two of the three women on stage really made that stand out. Kirsten Gillibrand also laid out her plan for a family bill of rights, which included national paid leave, universal pre-K, affordable daycare. She came out really strong in regard to these policies that have been debated but have not been brought center stage lately, as has immigration and healthcare.
For sure, she was carving out a position there.
Yes.
If you like. I think I would add Pete Buttigieg into that second tier, potentially Bill de Blasio, but it's, as we mentioned in the previous conversation, he's got no infrastructure at the moment, so it'll be interesting to see what he does between now and the next debate in terms of whether he takes things forward in that regard or not.
I think it'll also be interesting to see what happens to the polls in regard to the people that didn't do as well in the debate, such as Beto O'Rourke, Joe Biden, more importantly, because after the show last night, and I say show because I think that a lot of people in the United States tend to take these as an entertainment spectacle instead of something that they should be taking very seriously. I think it's going to be very important to keep up with the polls and see what happens to those voters that maybe said Joe Biden because they were familiar with him, but after seeing him actually debate, may change their minds and shift the numbers a little bit.
Sure. We certainly know that Beto O'Rourke's numbers are going down a little bit as we speak. I mean, as has been said many times before, at this stage of the very early stage of the electoral cycle, you certainly can't win it, but you sure as hell can lose it. Thanks, Fernanda.
That's well said.